Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz. It's so great to see you again.
Hi. Congratulations on your new studio. It looks beautiful.
I know. I'm so excited that we're here and you get to join us today. All right, so let's get started, Professor. As you know, we always open our show with special guests. Today, our first guest is David Efron, born in Cuba. David is a prominent lawyer and businessman who serves as Israel's honorary consul for Puerto Rico. David is also an old friend of yours. On a recent visit to Israel, he took your advice and made a day trip that answered a lot of issues, but also raised some questions. Let's hear from him.
Alan, for a long time you've been suggesting that I go see Ramallah for myself, and I finally did. And what I found was that there was absolutely no military occupation. I did not see one Israeli soldier from the time I left the checkpoint in Israel until the end of my stay in Ramallah. And I found a lot of modern hospitals, high-tech buildings, modern office buildings, fancy cars, a lot of successful, hardworking people, and people who want to have a solution to the situation with a two-state solution with Israel. So this is what I taped while I was there for.
Hi, Alan. I'm here in Ramallah, of all places, and from the people I've spoken to, much like most Israelis, everybody's looking forward and wish a two-state solution. What can we do to make this happen, and for how much longer can Israel continue to be a Jewish and, more importantly, a democratic state without a two-state solution? Hope to see you soon.
David, it's so nice to hear from you and to see you in Ramallah. David Efron is a great lawyer and a great friend of Israel. He serves in an honorary capacity as the consul in Puerto Rico. He's originally a Cuban Jew, a very prominent person in Miami. So I really appreciate your question. David, as you know, I have urged people, students and others, that their first stop when they go to the Middle East for the first time, the first stop should always be Ramallah, because it immediately tells the viewer that what he's been hearing about the occupation is only a partial truth and really not a truth at all. That there are parts of the West Bank, Ramallah, Jericho, many others, that are simply not under occupation. You simply never see an Israeli policeman, a soldier. There's self-determination, there's self-rule. And that's what a Palestinian state could look like. You know, when Israel was built, it was built from the ground down. When Winston Churchill came to what was then called Palestine, he said, what is all this talk about a Jewish homeland in the future? There is a Jewish homeland. They have a legislature, they have newspapers, they have universities, they have hospitals. That's the way you build a state, from the bottom up. And I think the Palestinians are building a state in Ramallah and other areas of the West Bank. There is only one solution to the conflict, and that is the two-state solution. It's the only solution that will work. None of the others that have been proposed carry the promise of Israel remaining the nation state of the Jewish people and the democratic nation state of the Jewish people. So we have to move vigorously in that direction. Prime Minister Netanyahu, to his credit, has said that he's ready to negotiate toward a two-state solution with no preconditions, without even the Palestinians announcing in advance that they accept Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. So the ball is now clearly in the Palestinian court. They have to come to the negotiating table. You cannot get a state without negotiation. You're not going to get a state through BDS. You're not going to get a state through the United Nations, through the International Criminal Court. So if the Palestinians want the rest of the West Bank to look like Ramallah with land swaps, obviously, and other accommodations, they have to come to the negotiating table. Both sides have to make the kinds of painful compromises that all real negotiations entail.
All right, thanks for your response, Professor. Our next guest is Dr. Mark Heller. Mark is a principal research associate at the prestigious Institute for National Security Studies based in Tel Aviv. He's a popular lecturer and has authored many studies and thoughtful books. So let's hear what's on his mind today.
Hello, Alan. I wanted to ask you a question about the New World Order. You know, despite the intimate security and intelligence ties between Israel and the United States, for 8 years under Barack Obama, the political relationship was pretty testy. And President Obama was very much resented by government circles in Israel and on the right side of the political spectrum. And those same people actually were quite jubilant when he was replaced last November by Donald Trump. Now, it turns out that in the months since Trump has occupied the White House, that all of his policy statements on Israel and the Palestinians have been more in the nature of campaign promises than actual policy implemented. And he spent most of his time walking back what people thought his position was on things like moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, taking the brakes off on settlement activity, or even trashing the so-called two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So my question to you is, was all this just campaign rhetoric, or is Trump actually being moderated by his encounter with reality? And was the jubilation on the part of the Israeli right at his election premature, not to say entirely unfounded?
A great question, Mark. As usual, you hit the nail right on the head. Look, every president has campaigned on moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and once they get into office, they see the reality of how difficult that will be, how they have to maintain alliances and relationships with the Saudis, with the Egyptians, with the Emirates, with the Jordanians, and that any movement of the embassy to Jerusalem will require coordination with our allies. Look, the embassy should be moved to Jerusalem. The excuse for not moving it is that it would somehow recognize Israel's claim on East Jerusalem. That's just total nonsense. The embassy would be in West Jerusalem. West Jerusalem has been part of Israel since 1948. There's been a Jewish majority in West Jerusalem, indeed in all of Jerusalem, since the early 19th century. Israel was kicked out of the Jewish quarter illegally, and it was illegally occupied by Jordan. But putting aside the Jewish quarter, putting aside the areas that were acquired in a defensive war in 1967, the embassy belongs in West Jerusalem, and it should go there. And the Jordanians and the Egyptians and the Emirates and the Saudis should agree to that without any predisposition of what will happen in East Jerusalem. That's an issue to be resolved during negotiations. Look, I've known Donald Trump not well, but I've known him for a long time as a businessman, as a pragmatist. He is not an ideologue. He's largely pragmatic. He likes to win. He likes to get things done. I'm hoping that he will put pressure on the Palestinians to come to the bargaining table. But I do think that he's not going to allow unlimited expansion of settlement activities. I think he is going to be cautious and try to hold himself out, as he said during the campaign, as an honest broker. So we have to wait and see. I think it's important to keep the pressure on both sides, and it's important for us who support Israel to keep the pressure on both the Republicans and the Democrats. Look, we won an important victory recently by defeating Keith Ellison for chairmanship. Of course, he was made co-chairman or deputy chairman. That wasn't a good thing, but at least he wasn't made the elected chairman. So I think we have to keep the pressure on all sides, and I think the two-state solution will be good for Israel, it will be good for the Palestinians, it will be good for the United States, it will be good for Israel's new allies in the Middle East in the war against Iran, which is the primary enemy, the Shia crescent extending from Iran to Shia parts of Iraq to Hezbollah with Syria in the middle, and then landing ultimately in Gaza, which is Sunni, but nonetheless supportive of Hezbollah's terrorism. So I think we have to keep the alliance strong, the Sunni alliance strong against the Shia enemies of America and enemies of Israel. And I hope President Trump will do that. I did not vote for him. I supported Hillary Clinton, but Donald Trump is our president, and I will support his efforts to make peace in the Middle East.
Thanks, Professor. Turning now to another question from the Holy Land. Michael Rosenblatt is a lawyer who was raised in Connecticut but has now made Israel his home. It's no wonder why he's constantly comparing the fundamental rights that are guaranteed by the American Constitution with those that exist in Israel. Let's hear from him.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. My name is Mike from Connecticut originally, and now living in Israel and working as a lawyer at one of Israel's big law firms. The question I wanted to ask you is about the constitutional right for freedom of speech in Israel as we compare it to the United States. In the United States, it's a very strong constitutional right, very broad, whereas in Israel, which doesn't even actually have a constitution, the right for freedom of expression in general is curbed by other laws that try to prevent speech that might hurt religious sentiment or incite to violence. My question to you is, how can Israel find the balance between this very important right of freedom of speech, which is important for the existence of any democracy, and at the same time protect itself, where we see members of Knesset and certain sections of the population that would use this freedom of speech to try to undermine the state of Israel, its democratic character, or its Jewish character? Thank you.
Mike, it's a great question. I'm glad you're in Israel and working with a great law firm there. Let me start with a story. 10 days before his assassination, Prime Minister Rabin asked the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Itamar Rabinovich, to arrange a meeting between me and the Prime Minister when he was going to be scheduled to come to New York to speak at the General Assembly of Jewish organizations. And the subject that he wanted to talk to me about was the rising incitement and hate speech in Israel during the election. And he was, of course, threatened by people who thought of him as a, quote, a rodef, a traitor to Israel and a danger to Israel. And he wanted to talk to me about whether there could be restrictions on that kind of hate and incitement speech consistent with the spirit of freedom of speech. The tragedy, of course, is he was killed a week after we had arranged the lunch, and he didn't come to America, and we never had that meeting. I still have the meeting in my book. I could never erase it because I had such strong positive feelings about Yitzhak Rabin, as I have about many other of Israel's prime ministers. The reality is that there is actually more freedom of speech in Israel than in the United States. What do I mean by when I say that? Israel doesn't have a constitutional right of free speech, although the basic laws and the Supreme Court have interpreted the basic laws to give broad free speech. But technically, theoretically, there is less freedom of speech in Israel than the United States, but there's actually more freedom of speech. There's far more criticism of government and individuals in Israel by Haaretz, by Yediot Ahronot, by the television stations, than exists in America. Things are said about leaders in Israel and about the Israeli government that would never be said about leaders, even about controversial leaders like Donald Trump in the United States. So there's no real limit on freedom of speech in Israel. There is no perfect solution to striking a balance between free speech, incitement, hate speech. Every country throughout history has tried to strike that balance, none with perfect success. I have on my wall a letter from Thomas Jefferson written in his hand in 1801, in which he asks how to strike the balance. He would strike it in favor of more speech. Some would strike it in favor of more safety. Every country has the right to strike the balance their own way, as long as it permits, as long as the balance permits dissent and no punishment for the expression of controversial views. That is true in the United States. It's equally true in Israel today.
All right, well, speaking of this issue, just recently the Knesset passed a very controversial bill restricting BDS supporters from entering Israel. I'm sure you've heard about it. While the bill was written to protect Israel against BDS, some people claim the bill discourages people who may have been associated with liberal causes from speaking out against policies they don't agree with. Critics also claim that the bill may even lead to preventing people from visiting Israel where they can actually see things for themselves. Would you say that this bill hinders free speech?
I think the bill itself is foolish. It can't possibly have any positive effect. The BDS is supported by some Israelis. You see articles in Haaretz sometimes supporting BDS. Television is international. The media is international. Israeli citizens don't need to be protected against bigots who support the BDS movement. And the BDS is a bigoted movement. It's not a movement at all, really, because it only focuses on Israel. There are many anti-Semitic elements to the BDS policies because it focuses only on Israeli Jews. I myself am subject to the BDS movement. Bagrudi, the head of it, won't debate me because I'm a Jewish Zionist, much like Matisyahu was not allowed to perform in Spain unless he renounced Israel. The BDS is wrong, and those of us who oppose it shouldn't be afraid of those who support it. We should defeat them in the marketplace of ideas. But it's absolutely foolish and wrong to try to ban people from coming to Israel if they support BDS or if they oppose Israeli policies. That's just not the way to approach it. By the way, every country has limitations on who can come into the country. For years, the United States didn't allow people in who expressed communist views, who expressed views that were even socialist. There are Supreme Court decisions on that. So there is a difference between free speech and who you let into a country. Having said that, I think it's a very, very serious mistake to try to ban people from coming to Israel who express views that are wrong and who express views that are very anti-Israel. That's not the way immigration rules should be used, and I think we have to encourage people to come to Israel to see for themselves. Minds actually get changed. Many of you know the story about the young Arab man who was about to become a jihadist, and he read my book, The Case for Israel, and he decided to come to Israel and see for himself, and he became a Muslim Zionist as a result of his visit to Israel. So we should encourage people to come to Israel, to visit Ramallah, to visit various other places in Israel, and to see the complex nature of the Israel-Palestine conflict.
As they say, Israel is more than just politics. All right, before we get to our final question of the day, we wish to note the passing of Judge Joseph A. Wapner. Judge Wapner was a California judge who became a widely recognized symbol of tough but fair-minded American jurisprudence. For over 12 years, he sat on the bench of the popular syndicated television show, The People's Court. He passed away recently at his home in Los Angeles at the age of 97. Judge Wapner's groundbreaking People's Court was a daytime series on which real-life plaintiffs and defendants from California's small claims courts would argue their cases before him. His show led to many others that are with us today. He gave verdicts in disputes over missing pets, encroaching fences, or botched hairdos, and his even-handed hearing of cases let millions of viewers know that no matter how seemingly insignificant their legal disputes, they too were entitled to their day in court. Now, Professor, how do you feel about the contribution of Judge Wapner and his followers in bringing the law closer to everyday people?
As you probably know, there was a poll that showed that more Americans knew the name of Judge Wapner than knew the name of the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
It's unbelievable.
He was extraordinarily popular and well-loved. My good friend, Red Auerbach, who was the legendary coach of the Boston Celtics basketball team, when he found out that Judge Wapner was my friend, he begged me to introduce them, and we went to a basketball game together, and sure enough, Judge Wapner was there in Los Angeles, and I brought them together, and they became good friends. One thing people don't know about Judge Wapner is he was an ardent Zionist, a very strong supporter of Israel. We first met at a Zionist event at the Brandeis Bardin Institute outside of Los Angeles, and we maintained a close friendship for many, many years. I think he contributed enormously to American understanding of law. Today, I think there are some rip-off shows that don't do as good a job. But I think his show really portrayed the law in its best form. An anecdote that nobody knows about, I think I'm revealing it for the first time on television. After the success of Donald Trump's The Apprentice, I was asked by the Trump team whether I would be prepared to start a show essentially called The Legal Apprentice. It was called The Law Firm. And my job would be, as The Apprentice was, to evaluate young lawyers, and at the end of the show to say to one of them, "You're fired." I said, no, I wouldn't do that. I would do it if I could say at the end of the show to one of the people, "You're hired." But I've never fired anybody in my life, and I didn't want to do that. And And so I declined the opportunity to do a show, which would have been much like Judge Wapner's show. It was small claims and lawyers arguing it and then me judging who the best lawyers were. But it was not to be, and I turned it down, and in the end, they picked somebody else, but the show was not a success. But Judge Wapner's show was an amazing success, and Judge Judy and some others are very, very popular. People watch them, and they really get a sense of how the law works from watching these shows. So I will miss Judge Wapner. He was a great, great man, a real mensch, and just a good guy.
Absolutely. Well, Professor, maybe we're going to have to try that show here in Israel. We'll see about that. All right, our last question comes in the spirit of the Purim holiday from Hila Elias. She knows about your reputation as a lawyer of last resort and wonders if you have your own limitations in choosing clients. Let's hear from her.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. As a defense attorney, you've had some pretty nasty clients, but would you represent anybody? Let's say Haman would walk into your office. Would you take his case? And how would you defend him?
Great question. Well, I have already defended Haman. We had a moot court at Harvard some years ago where Haman was prosecuted and I was picked to be his defense attorney. The first thing I did was move for a change of venue because I said in the synagogue, it was Keheleth, Israel, and I said in the synagogue, we couldn't get a fair trial because every time Haman's name is mentioned, people make noise. And that obviously shows discrimination. Then I argued that Haman was genetically descendant from Amalek, so he never really had a fair shot. And finally, that he was entrapped by the beautiful Esther, and that therefore his constitutional rights were violated. It ended up, as you might expect, with a, quote, hung jury. So yes, the legal system requires that everybody have a defense, and it was fun for me to defend Haman. I've also defended Abraham on charges of attempted murder. I've defended Moses on his killing of the Egyptian taskmaster, and David for his arranging the death of Bathsheba's husband in order to make her eligible to be married. So putting biblical characters on trial is a lot of fun, and the responsibility isn't as great as when you have real people who you have to defend who may then go out and do terrible things. That's the way our legal system operates. It's a great legal system. It is all derived from the Bible. Al pi shnayim edim, on the basis of two witnesses shall you prosecute. The Bible sets out all the rules that eventually become the obligation of criminal defense lawyers. The Talmud says that if a Sanhedrin was quickly unanimous about a verdict, that really means that there was no opportunity for the defense to be presented. So Jewish law is very supportive of the right of everybody to receive a defense and fair trials. Even the sinners of Sodom were defended by Abraham. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Will the judge of all the world not himself be judged as Chalila Laka? So, we have a role model in Abraham. We have a role model in Moses arguing on behalf of the Jewish people just in the Sedra a couple of weeks ago. If you do not forgive the Jewish people who were innocent, you can erase me from your book. So the model of the vigorous defense lawyer is present in the Bible and throughout Jewish sources.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for your time, Professor. I also want to thank all of our guests. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to iltv.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week. Thanks, Alan.